Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's continue with our discussion about history of life on Earth. This is a lengthy and very dense chapter, so I am literally skimming through, but I urge you to please read this chapter to flesh it out. Remember that what I teach you in class is just a skeleton. Please flesh it out by reading additional material. So, first of all, we are in modern times, we accept that the Earth as we see it now is not the way that it has always been, and likewise that the organisms that we see on the Earth now are not the same organisms that have always been present on the Earth. To us, that seems almost self-evident. But that would have been a revolutionary idea in the 17th and 18th century, where it was accepted that the Earth was created entire and had remained essentially immutable ever since its creation. However, that process of constant change, both of the structure of the Earth, the geology and everything, and changes in the organisms, is the only way that we can explain things like, for instance, that we can find the skeletons of whales in the middle of the Sahara Desert. We find those skeletons in the middle of the Sahara Desert, not because whales walked on land, they swam in the ocean just as they had done before, but that what we're looking at here in the Sahara here was once ocean floor. It is now dry land. Second, that's a major change in the structure of the Earth, the structure of the geology. But when we look at the skeletons of the whales that we find that those two are different. Change has taken place between skeletons of whales as we find them fossilized in the Sahara Desert and the skeletons of whales that are modern. So change has taken place, and those two changes, in fact, are very often linked. Changes in structure of the Earth implies changes in structure in climate, changes in environment, environmental pressures, evolutionary pressures, which drive evolutionary change. So the kind of change that we're going to be talking about most of all is macroevolutionary change. Microevolutionary change is the kind of change which leads to the development of new species, for example, on the Galapagos. And those are really tremendously important changes because they do drive all of evolution, but those are not the kind of changes which lead to major acquisitions of new characteristics or to the development of whole new groups of organisms. Those macroevolutionary changes take place usually over a much longer period of time, and very often can be attributed, one of the driving forces for them can be attributed to major impacts on populations, like continental drift, like mass extinctions, that sort of thing. These macroevolutionary changes, there are many of them, and we observe them very clearly in the fossil record. They occur over a very long period of time, and things like, for example, the emergence of terrestrial vertebrates. That is going to be one of our topics of discussion. And in looking at something like the evolution of the terrestrial vertebrates, we're going to see the impact of things like mass extinctions, continental drift, changes in structure of the continents over time. And these, when we look, for example, at the vertebrates, we see the development even within first of all, the development of that group, the vertebrates. But second of all, when we look at that group, the vertebrates, we see within the vertebrates the development of major trends, major morphological trends that we can follow. We can follow them through the fossil record. Things like what seems simple to us, it's not simple at all. The fact that a group of vertebrates arose, which were tetrapods. They have 4 limbs. Within those tetrapods, most have pentadactyl limb. They have 5 digits on those. we look at those limbs and we see how some of them become adapted for flight, others for walking, others for running. These are macroevolutionary changes. So let's go right the way back, and we're going to skim through some of the ideas about the origin of life. We'll also try to put a timing on it to understand how long a period of time this has taken place over. These macroevolutionary changes have taken place over a tremendous amount of time. The Earth was formed as a planet about 4.6 billion years ago. For much of its early history, it was completely inhospitable to life. Life could not have evolved early on. First of all, because it was very hot. And in fact, much of the Earth was lava, was liquid rock, because of the tremendous heat generated from inside the planet, but also from a constant bombardment with very large asteroids and things like that, which were smashing into the surface of the planet. There was no liquid water, and without liquid water, life cannot evolve. There was plenty of water, but the water was all vapor. It was all water vapor. And that water vapor was largely brought in by the geological material which impacted the surface of the Earth and actually led to the formation of the planet. But until about 4 billion years ago, the planet was simply too hot for liquid water to occur. In addition, there was no free oxygen. There was plenty of oxygen, but oxygen is a very, very reactive molecule, and it mostly formed oxides with the abundant metals that were present in the surface in the structure of the planet. The atmosphere was very rich in carbon dioxide and many other compounds which were being released from this continual volcanic activity and from this continual movement of this liquid rock that formed the surface of the Earth. There was many nitrogen compounds, for example. And if you think about it, now we've got nitrogen compounds, we've got carbon dioxide. There may also have been simple organic molecules like methane present. There were other things like ammonia and lots of hydrogen. So when you look at that structure of the atmosphere, you realize that this is what we call a reducing atmosphere. There's no oxygen to oxidize things, but there's abundant hydrogen, for example. And the hydrogen can begin to reduce the simple carbon compounds. It can begin to reduce the carbon dioxide, and it can begin to reduce the simple methane molecules and begin to build bigger carbon molecules by doing that. Think back to the first set of biology lectures you did, where we learned about macromolecules and how most biological molecules are polymers of carbon compounds, right? And many of them are highly reduced. They're carbons with many, many hydrogens attached to them. That is a common characteristic of organic molecules. These, we believe, could begin to form on the planet. Even complex organic molecules could begin to form without any life existing. And this happened over a very long period of time. So here are some of the steps we have to visualize. It's a long way from a solution of organic molecules, which have just formed spontaneously in the absence of life, to talking about something that constitutes a living cell. And that is our end point. That our discussion about life on Earth must begin with the construction of the first cells, or the first protocells. They probably didn't look anything like modern cells. They would have had some of the characteristics, but we accept that there were early versions of the cell, of which one ultimately succeeded in forming something that approximated what we would recognize today as being a cell. So first of all, we've got to have this abiotic synthesis of the organic molecules. Most of those molecules were relatively small compared to the giant molecules like proteins and things which living things can produce, but nonetheless, they were reduced, many of them reduced carbon compounds, which had the potential at least to polymerize. So there would be some degree of polymerization, creation of organic molecules, and eventually these became abundant, relatively abundant in the primordial oceans that were forming. These were extremely warm oceans, and this you'll often see referred to as the primordial soup, because it was just like a soup. It's like a broth of liquid with many different organic molecules, all derived from spontaneous processes. There's a giant step now that we don't really understand clearly, and that is how these molecules began to be assembled into the protocells. But we know that there's one major step that has to be accomplished, and that is that there has to be the development of a membrane. There has to be a membrane developed which encloses molecules which begin to behave in a certain way. We know that that has to be the case because the inside of the cell has to be radically different to the outside. For the processes which we associate with metabolism, that sort of thing, for example, molecules need to be concentrated within a certain geographic proximity for the reactions to occur. And we visualize this in modern cells. We look and we see the cell membrane around the outside, and we know conditions on one side of the membrane are very different to the conditions on the outside of the membrane. And that is an essential step, because otherwise, if there's no membrane, all of the molecules simply disperse. They dissipate into that primordial soup. Molecules need to be in proximity for them to react properly. There has to be creation of a protocell, but the next step is that protocell has to begin to replicate for it to be regarded as being alive. Those are giant steps, the formation of a cell and then the movement to replication that we do not really understand. We think we have some idea, but those are steps which are poorly understood. The history is poorly understood and of course is lost in geological time. We have empirical evidence that some of these steps could indeed have happened, and that our ideas are probably more or less correct. Very early experiments were done in the 1950s by Miller and Urey, very, very famous names in biology, who demonstrated that the abiotic synthesis of organic molecules, even quite complex organic molecules, was possible in an atmosphere which resembled the theorized reducing atmosphere of the early Earth. Now what they did was, it was a relatively simple experiment. They had a chamber, and in that chamber, they had a mixture of gases, which they thought resembled the structure of the early atmosphere of the Earth. No oxygen, but lots of molecules such as peroxides, hydrogen itself, methane, ammonia, these sorts of things. And Miller and Urey placed a lot of importance on the activity of lightning, of electricity in the atmosphere in generating these molecules. They believed that that was a major driving force for the formation of early organic molecules. So they had a powerful electric spark inside this mixture of gases, and they then passed through this chamber, they passed water vapor, knowing that there was plenty of water vapor, no liquid water, but water vapor in the atmosphere in the early atmosphere. They then, they're passing water vapor through this. They're continually sparking these gases together. And any compound that is produced then is mixed in with that water vapor, and they condense the water vapor out, and they could then sample that. And they indeed did find many even really complex but relatively small organic molecules. They found all sorts of things like amino acids and all of those kinds of compounds, which was a revolutionary finding at that time, and proof positive that under these kinds of conditions, in fact, these simple compounds could have been formed. The building blocks of biomolecules could have indeed been formed by that. There's a problem, and that is there's a tremendous amount of argument about the nature of the early atmosphere. But even if the atmosphere did not necessarily exactly resemble the Miller-Urey atmosphere, we know that in fact organic molecules can be formed under many different circumstances now. We can see the formation of organic molecules, for example, at deep sea volcanic vents, not the black smoke of very, very hot vents that you may have heard of, but there is another set of volcanic vents where the water is not quite as hot, and where the solutions emerge which are very rich in carbon dioxide and in hydrogen. And under those circumstances, we are able to demonstrate that simple organic compounds are also accomplished. But here's another one, which is really amazing. And how this occurs is not really known, but many, many meteorites, solid material coming into the Earth from space. Many of these meteorites, when you analyze them carefully, you find that they actually contain really amazing compounds. They contain amino acids, they contain lipids, simple sugars, and they even contain nitrogenous bases. The bases that, for example, are utilized in nucleic acids. This is amazing because this suggests that there are other abiotic processes taking place where these compounds are created. They survive entry to the Earth's atmosphere, and they would have contributed to that primordial soup. And so we have various sources: atmospheric abiotic synthesis, maybe some volcanic volcanoes themselves, but volcanic vents in the ocean, for example, and meteorites may all have been sources of organic molecules. Now we've got to take a giant leap and start to think, well, how is it that these could begin to acquire characteristics which could be handed on? How is it that these protocells could begin to acquire characteristics which could be handed on to the succeeding generations of cells if they could somehow divide? Many of the compounds, of the simple compounds that we find, such as the simple sugars and the nitrogenous bases, in fact, would more likely have contributed to the construction of ribonucleic acid than deoxyribonucleic acid for various reasons. But there's a very important aspect about RNA, ribonucleic acids, functioning, which DNA does not have, and which is essential. And that is that RNA can act as an enzyme. And we believe that RNA molecules, which when they have enzymatic activity, we call them ribozymes, are able to catalyze many different reactions. And one of the reactions that they can catalyze is the synthesis of copies of short stretches of RNA. In other words, they are able to replicate themselves. And we believe that these early protocells actually had RNA as their hereditary material. So just give me 1 second, please. I'm trying to do something here. Oh no, David.